Well, that's it for our look back on 2023. I hope you enjoyed it. And of course, we can carry on the conversation on X, which, funny enough, began the year being called Twitter. X me, I'll X you back. You can get me at BBC Aaron. From me and all the Talking Business team, we wish you a happy and healthy 2024. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Live from Washington, this is BBC News. After days of delays, the United Nations passes a measure demanding more humanitarian aid for Gaza, but stops short of calling for an immediate truce.
The vote is as follows: 13 votes in favor, 0 votes against, 2 abstentions.
Hamas pledges not to release any more hostages until the war ends, as we learn an Israeli American died while being held captive in Gaza. Plus, Donald Trump not going to get the speedy help he might have wanted from the U.S. Supreme Court to avoid prosecution on charges he allegedly tried to overturn the 2020 presidential election. Hello, I'm Carl Nasman. After days of negotiations to avoid a U.S. veto, the UN Security Council has approved a resolution demanding large-scale aid deliveries to Gaza. It stopped short of calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. 13 council members voted for the resolution. The U.S. and Russia abstained. Now, the resolution was sponsored by the United Arab Emirates. Its ambassador to the UN says the decision responds to the dire situation on the ground. The Palestinian ambassador to the UN called it a step in the right direction, but reiterated calls for an immediate ceasefire, saying the 2.3 million Palestinians have been fighting for their lives and facing death. Meanwhile, Israel's ambassador to the UN criticized the resolution, saying that the UN should have focused on the humanitarian crisis of the hostages. Now, he also thanked the US for its support of Israel. For more on the day's events, our correspondent John Sudworth sent this update from Washington. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Let's take a look now at some other stories making headlines. Millions of people on the move across the UK as the Christmas getaway begins. There have been queues at the port of Dover, a surge in demand for ferries caused by yesterday's Eurotunnel strike in France. Road and train travel also heavy amid network rail disruptions, with more than 13 million journeys predicted between today and Sunday. The Swiss government says it will introduce a global minimum tax rate of 15% for multinational corporations starting next year. It's meant to prevent the loss of tax revenue to other countries. Voters supported the move in a referendum back in June. The Bosnian capital, Sarajevo, topped the list of the world's most polluted cities for the second straight day on Wednesday. The capital has been battling toxic haze that's been covering the city. Now, a Swiss air quality company put Sarajevo's air quality index at 301 on Wednesday, followed by the Indian city of Kolkata at 239. You're live with BBC News. Here in Washington, the U.S. Supreme Court has declined for now to decide whether former President Donald Trump is immune from prosecution on federal charges of attempting to overturn the 2020 election. Special counsel Jack Smith was hoping to speed up the process for the 4 separate charges that Mr. Trump faces. Now, the trial was initially set to begin in March, but could be delayed for several months. Mr. Trump denies the charges, but claims that any of his actions while in office should be covered under presidential immunity. President Biden has expanded his pardon for Americans with federal criminal convictions for marijuana offenses. The White House granted clemency to those who were convicted of simple possession and using cannabis on federal land and in the District of Columbia. Thousands of people are now expected to have their criminal records expunged. A pardon last year was issued for possession convictions. In a statement, Mr. Biden said his actions would help make the promise of equal justice a reality. He went on to say criminal records for marijuana use and possession have imposed needless barriers to employment, housing, and educational opportunities. Too many lives have been upended because of our failed approach to marijuana. It's time that we right these wrongs. Now, Black Americans are nearly 4 times more likely than white Americans to be arrested and convicted for marijuana possession, despite similar usage rates. Several states have legalized the production, distribution, and medical or recreational use of cannabis. President Biden repeated his call for governors and state legislators to take similar steps to erase marijuana convictions. We are now hearing from an Oklahoma man who served the longest wrongful imprisonment in U.S. history is now free. He says it was a lesson in resilience and tenacity. Glenn Simmons was jailed in 1974 and was only freed last year when a court ordered he should have a new trial. Prosecutors now say there is not enough evidence to warrant one, and he's been formally declared innocent. And before we go, it's a tradition like no other during the holiday season. We're talking about the El Gordo, or the Fat One. It's an annual Spanish lottery draw where families, friends, and coworkers traditionally buy a €20 ticket hoping for a piece of the €2.6 billion prize. This year's jackpot, check your tickets, went to the number 88008. It's now worth €400,000 for each ticket. It is considered the biggest and most famous lottery draw in the world. I'm Carl Nasman. Stay with us right here on BBC News.
This is BBC News. We'll have the headlines for you at the top of the hour, which is straight after this programme.
Live from Washington, this is BBC News. After days of delays, the United Nations passes a measure demanding more humanitarian aid for Gaza, but stops short of calling for an immediate truce.
13 votes in favour, 0 votes against, 2 abstentions.
And Hamas pledges not to release any more hostages until the war ends, as reports emerge of the death of an Israeli-American citizen kidnapped by the group. Plus, the U.S. Supreme Court says it won't fast-track a decision regarding potential immunity for former President Donald Trump. Hello, I'm Carl Nasman. After days of negotiations to avoid a U.S. veto, the UN Security Council has approved a resolution demanding large-scale aid deliveries to Gaza. It stopped short of calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. 13 council members voted for the resolution. The U.S. and Russia abstained. Now, the resolution was sponsored by the United Arab Emirates. Its ambassador to the UN says the decision responds to the dire situation on the ground. The Palestinian ambassador to the UN called it a step in the right direction, but reiterated calls for an immediate ceasefire, saying that 2.3 million Palestinians have been fighting for their lives and facing death. Meanwhile, Israel's ambassador to the UN criticized the resolution and said that the UN should have focused on the humanitarian crisis of the hostages. Gilad Erdan also thanked the US for its support of Israel. For more on the day's events, our correspondent John Sudworth sent this update from Washington. Here's a look now at some other news making headlines. Japan announced on Friday it's preparing to ship Patriot missiles to the United States shortly after it revised arms export guidelines for the first time in 9 years. Deadly weapons exports are strictly limited under Japan's pacifist constitution introduced after the Second World War. The announcement comes as Japan seeks to boost its defense industry. Malaysia's prime minister announced a ban on ships hoisting Israeli flags from docking at Malaysian ports on Wednesday. This comes as the country seeks to sever direct trade ties with Israel over the ongoing war in Gaza. Malaysia does not maintain diplomatic relations with Israel and has long championed Palestinian rights and causes. Some non-Malays are opposing the move, citing its possible economic impact. Millions of people are on the move across the UK as the Christmas getaway starts. There have been queues at the port of Dover, a surge in demand for ferries caused by yesterday's Eurotunnel strike in France. And road and rail travel is also heavy amid network rail disruptions, with more than 13 million journeys predicted between today and Saturday. China's air pollution in 2023 worsened for the first time in a decade, according to a new study released Friday. A Finnish nonprofit institute found that the level of pollution increased compared to 2013 levels. That's the year when Beijing declared a war on pollution that saw air quality improve. And 5 new species of soft-furred hedgehogs have been discovered by scientists in the tropical forests of Southeast Asia. High-low Mies are members of the same family as the more familiar hedgehog, but are covered in fur rather than spines. Natural history researchers at the Smithsonian Museum in Philadelphia also reevaluated 2 previously unidentified hedgehog specimens that had been in storage for decades. Author, ecologist, and spokesperson for the British Hedgehog Preservation Society, Hugh Warwick, told us just how exciting this new discovery is. I'm Carl Nasman here in Washington. Stay with us right here on BBC News.
Hello there. Christmas for most of us looks likely to be a mild one. In fact,